at the second portion of this reading, which is going to be about British in North America. All right. The first thing we see is the importance of the Anglo-Dutch rivalry. This is just a quick little thought. It's kind of interesting. When we look up here, you guys probably know this region is New York. In New York, the first people who settled this is the Dutch West India Company. And the Dutch West India Company was the first European country that I know of that settled this region that we know as New York. It's going to be this area right about here, okay? And as they settled it, they began to really change the nature of this area. You've heard of the island of Manhattan, I hope. You probably heard of the area called Harlem. Those are two areas that were heavily impacted by the Dutch. Unfortunately for the Dutch, you guys located the Dutch Republic in a map this summer. You should already know the Dutch are really small. We're going to find out the English are going to dominate, and the outcome of that is there's going to be a small little skirmish between the English and the Dutch, and the Dutch lose. So therefore, the English are going to colonize this region. That's just that little idea. It goes with the way Dr. Spielvogel is teaching you new rivalries, the Anglo-Dutch rivalry. Who's the big winner? The English. Now, before I move on, as I move on, I do want to talk about the importance of joint stock companies. Tomorrow's conversation, we will talk about the development of joint stock companies. But I want to tell you, the joint stock companies are where a group of merchants share economic risk. Joint stock companies can be found throughout Europe during this time period, but they also began to believe they can reap rewards for colonization. Think about the one we've already talked about. We've already talked about which joint stock company in India. Of course, the British East India Company. We've evaluated a little bit about that, and we'll see that's going to make more sense later. But what other joint stock companies have you heard of before? Maybe the Hudson Bay Company, maybe the Virginia Company of London. I hope you've heard of those two, at least Virginia Company of London. And what we know is as England began to develop its own age of discovery, the English government, led by the Tudors, relied on the burghers, the merchants. And the merchants are going to be the ones that really reach out to colonize. They look to colonize areas for profit. So what the English king did, the English king gave monopolies to these joint stock companies if they found wealth in their colonies. And of course, the first one we know is Jamestown. Jamestown is 1607. Okay. We know that the Hudson Bay Company formed this a little bit later. And we may know about the Massachusetts Bay Company. And these group of merchants would get a monopoly, and they would be able to establish colonies. And remember, the colonies were about profit. So the only thing I want you to know now is the merchants were the ones who initially pushed for colonization of North America for England. And I'm hoping you guys know the 13 colonies. And I hope you guys know British Canada. I'll show more about this later. Okay. So again, the British merchants began to colonize North America using joint stock companies. They would form colonies, get a monopoly from the king, and they hoped to strike rich. And for the most part, they believed North America was going to be similar to this region. Remember, Spain got tons and tons and tons of gold over here. Unfortunately, up here, there's not going to be as much gold, or actually no gold, but that's another story. But in the end, British North America began to form along the Atlantic seaboard and in Canada. I hope that makes sense. Now, when we look at the 13 colonies, these are the 13 colonies you should know. It goes from up here as well, sorry. It goes up here. It goes with Massachusetts all the way to Georgia. I am going to make an assumption you know the 13 colonies, but what I want to point out is the British colonies were created for a population outlet. Because England was becoming overpopulated, they were doing something called the enclosure movement, we might talk about a little bit later. And the enclosure movement was where nobles would would kick peasants off their land because they didn't want to deal with the peasants, and the peasants were forced to go to the cities, but the cities weren't able to hold them. So what happened? They would send the unwanted population to the 13 colonies. So as the 13 colonies began to form, what we see is this area becomes heavily populated. The English want to go west, and the British colonists are going to want to go west. And we'll see why that's important a little bit later. Now, with the population problem, again, population up here was getting overpopulated. Okay. What we see now is who controls the colonies. I want to point out very simply, these colonies became very independent, and we'll talk more about this later. But England wanted to control them. And that's going to create eventually that little thing called the American Revolution, which you probably have heard of course. But what we see, though, is during this time period, the Navigation Acts. Everybody see that? The Navigation Acts. Everybody see where we are in your assignment? The Navigation Acts were a mercantile law created by England to control the economies of North America. Once again, the Navigation Acts were an English law passed by Parliament that was meant to control the British colonies' economies. For example, the British colonies could only trade with England. All trade had to occur between the colonies and England. So therefore, the Dutch couldn't trade in these 13 colonies. We're going to see tomorrow why that's more important. But once again, what we see here very quickly, we see British North America begins to develop because of joint stock companies. We have the Hudson Bay Company. We have the Jamestown or the Virginia Company of London, and we have the Massachusetts Bay Company. Those were examples that we've talked about. And because of that, the British merchants were the ones responsible for creating the first colonies. Then we developed this, and we talk about the population. The 13 colonies became overpopulated. They became more independent. And what then began to happen, these colonies as they became more independent, England wanted to control them. And the Navigation Acts were that example. I hope that makes more sense, and we'll see what happens later.